There was a time when the Foden badge stood for something more than just horsepower and haulage. It stood for craftsmanship, for backbone, for British grit. These weren't just lorries built to do a job, they were rolling monuments to engineering done properly. Clean lines, strong chassis, dependable engines, and just enough pride under the bonnet to make a driver feel like they were steering something that mattered. And for much of the 20th century, Foden did matter. In fact, it mattered more than most. But like so many great British institutions, what started as a legacy of excellence eventually got chewed up by corporate takeovers, poor timing, and a world that moved on far too fast. Let's go back, way back, to the 1850s. That's how far the Foden name goes. Edwin Foden, the company's founder, was already making steam engines long before the first proper lorry ever rumbled down a cobbled road. And when steam gave way to diesel, Foden didn't just adapt, they led. Their trucks became a common sight across Britain's growing motorway network. You didn't need to squint to recognize one. There was a confidence in their design, a squareness, a strength. It didn't shout at you, but it didn't need to. It was Foden. That said it all. By the 1960s and 70s, Foden was banging out lorries that were built like tanks and twice as loyal. The S21, nicknamed the Mickey Mouse because of its distinct cab shape, was a driver's dream. It looked different, it drove different, and it had soul. You ask any old school haulier who spent time in a Foden cab and they'll get misty-eyed in seconds. Not because it was fancy, but because it worked. It held together. It didn't rattle apart like some of the imported stuff creeping into the scene by the late 70s. But it wasn't all sunshine and smooth gears. The British lorry industry in the 70s was a minefield. Leyland was struggling. ERF was trying to hold its ground. And the unions, well, they had their own ideas about how things should run. Foden was caught in the middle, still respected, still punching above its weight, but the pressure was building. New emissions laws, tighter margins, and increasing foreign competition, especially from the likes of Scania and Volvo, meant that even a rock-solid brand like Foden had to start bending. Then came the real turning point, and arguably the biggest misstep of the company's entire history. The two-stroke engine era. In a bid to set themselves apart, Foden began fitting some of their trucks with two-stroke diesels. Drivers hated them, mechanics despised them, and when a driver doesn't trust what's under his right foot, that brand loyalty starts to crack. The backlash was swift. Fleet managers who'd run Fodens for decades began jumping ship. Word of mouth, once the brand's greatest ally, turned toxic. That reputation for reliability, gone. All because of an engine experiment that sounded good in theory, but flopped on tarmac. From there, it was a slow bleed. Foden limped into the 1980s trying to rebuild. New cabs, smarter styling, better engines, this time 4 strokes thankfully. But the damage was done. The UK market was no longer the safe haven it once was. Japanese and European trucks were flooding in, and while Foden was still fighting, it was like watching an old boxer trying to stay upright in the 10th round. Respectable, brave, but overmatched. In 1980, the final blow came. PACCAR, the American giant behind brands like Kenworth and Peterbilt, bought Foden. At first, it seemed like a lifeline, a way to stabilize things, new investment, fresh energy. But it quickly became clear that the Foden identity was fading. It became a logo, not a legacy. A PACCAR nameplate with British roots and American marching orders. And over the years, model by model, the soul of Foden was stripped out. By the late 90s and early 2000s, Foden was more or less hanging on by a thread. The truck still looked decent, the EC range had its fans, but they weren't market leaders anymore, they were niche. And eventually, even PACCAR gave up the ghost. In 2006, production officially ceased. Trucks that weren't flashy, but meant something. And to many drivers, they still do. It's strange, isn't it? A brand that once ruled the haulage yards, reduced to nothing more than nostalgia and badge spotting at classic truck shows. And yet, somehow, Foden still lives on. Not in factories, but in memories. Ask any British trucker over 50 about Foden, and you'll get the same reaction every time. A pause, a grin, then a story, maybe about their first proper long-distance run behind the wheel of an old S83, or a winter job up the Pennines in an EC14 that never gave up, no matter how much the snow came down. There's emotion there, because unlike a lot of modern kit, Fodens had personality. They had presence. They were more than machines, they were mates. That's the thing corporate suits never understood. You can't replace loyalty with logistics, and Foden drivers were loyal to the bone. Not because they were paid to be, but because the trucks earned it. Time and time again, they took a beating, kept hauling, and looked sharp doing it. You didn't just drive a Foden, you wore it like a badge of honor, and it showed. Even in their final years, Foden kept trying. The Alpha series was a solid bit of kit, built under Packard's eye, but still carrying that British identity in its bones. Strong frame, reliable Cummins power under the cab, and a design that looked modern without feeling anonymous. But by then, it was already too late. Fleets were shifting to DAFs and Volvos, drivers were retiring, depots were consolidating, the world had moved on, and Foden, for all its stubborn brilliance, couldn't catch up. What's maybe most frustrating is that Foden had the tools to survive. The engineering skill, the history, the workforce, but they just didn't have the backing. Once the brand was absorbed, it was never really allowed to breathe again. Packer saw more promise in DAF, and to be fair, they weren't wrong from a global business standpoint, but it meant Foden became the forgotten middle child, too British to scale, too niche to save, and in 2006, when they finally pulled the plug, it wasn't even front page news. No send-off, no televised tribute, just silence. But trucks have a way of surviving in places where paperwork can't follow, and Fodens, real Fodens, are still out there. Not many mind, but you'll spot them if you know where to look. Working farms, independent builders, vintage hauliers who've kept one running because they refuse to let go. You'll hear that deep, honest growl from a Cummins engine on some back lane, and sure enough, there it is. A dusty Foden badge on a weathered grille, still earning its keep decades later. And then there's the show circuit. Classic truck festivals up and down Britain are packed with old ERFs, Scammels, Atkinsons, and always a proud lineup of Fodens. It's not just romanticism. Fodens were built. Heavy-duty chassis, proper cab ergonomics, and engine access that didn't require a computer science degree. Mechanics loved them, drivers respected them, and fleets that ran them rarely forgot them. There was something unmistakably British about the whole affair, not just in origins, but in attitude. These weren't flash trucks, they weren't chrome monsters like the American rigs, they didn't need to be. Fodens got on with it. Rain, snow, uphill with 20 tons of bricks. Didn't matter, the job got done. There's been whispers over the years, the occasional rumor about a comeback, a boutique relaunch, a name revival, but nothing serious ever came of it. The industry's changed too much. The big players have it locked down, and sadly, most of the original knowledge, the hands, the welders, the people who knew how to build a Foden, have moved on or hung up their boots. What's left is history, a legacy carried by a shrinking few. Still, it's not nothing, because for those who lived it, for the lads who sat in a Mickey Mouse cab or bombed down the M62 in an S104, the name Foden means more than any quarterly profit sheet ever could. It means pride. British engineering that punched above its weight. A reminder that we once built trucks that could take on anything the world threw at them. So when you see a restored Foden roll past, give it a nod. That ain't just a showpiece. That's a ghost of British haulage history, still thundering on long after the factories have gone quiet.